Okay, so that's the Iranian flag. Great. Next. Okay, well, background information for those of you who are less familiar. There's a map showing Iran, which is in the either the eastern edge of the Middle East or the western edge of Asia. It's in a strategically very important location. There is, I don't have a PowerPoint, I can't point to it, but down at the bottom right, near Oman, are the Straits of Hormuz, one of the critical trade choke points in the world. Something like a third of the, thank you, about a third of the world's shipping goes through that choke point, and Iran can cut it off at any time. Further north to the west is, of course, Iraq, the second largest Shia country in the world in population. Across the Persian Gulf is Saudi Arabia, its principal rival for influence and power in the Middle East. To the north in Iran are former states of the Soviet Union, now independent states. Azerbaijan, this is to the left there, Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia. And to the right, across the Black Sea, I think that is, or that's the Georgian Sea, is countries of Central Asia, now independent states from the Soviet Union, including Turkmenistan. And directly to the east is Afghanistan. So it has an awful lot of complex and strategically very significant borders. Looking at the overall statistics, it used to be called Persia. It has about over 80 million people. Second to Egypt, it's the second largest Middle East country in population. And it's second to Saudi Arabia in size. More than half the people speak Persian or Farsi, and about a little less than 20% speak Azerbaijani, which is another Shia majority country. And interestingly enough, only 2% speak Arabic, yet it's seeking to influence the whole Arabic world, which is largely to its west. And the next bullet I had mentioned, it's located strategically in Eurasia and Western Asia, and the Straits of Hormuz is so important as a trade route. Okay. Any questions about this? This is geostrategic position. Okay, so next. Iran is the largest Shia nation in population. 90% of its population is Shia. Iraq is second, with 63% of 40 million people. So Iraq is roughly half the population, and 2/3 of it is Shia. Iran, double the population of Iraq, and 90% of it is Shia. In more recent times, the Pahlavi dynasty controlled Iran, and it started that in the 1920s, right up till the Iranian Revolution of 1979, so it's over 50 years. And its name was changed from the imperial state of Persia in the Western world to Iran by the Shah's father, Reza Shah, in 1935. Okay, continue. A very key moment came in 1953 when, in a free election, Mossadegh, a prominent parliamentarian and lawyer, was freely elected as the prime minister of Iran, but he was interested in seizing the British oil refineries in Iran, and also had not necessarily communist, but socialist economic ideas, which made him inclined to discuss things with the Soviet Union, which made, from a Cold War perspective, from the United States, Iran a dangerous country that was maybe flipping from pro-Western to pro-Soviet. So this led to an approval by President Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles for a clandestine CIA activity with the British to overthrow Mossadegh. This was the first time an American operation of this kind was undertaken against a freely elected government since World War II. This is not remembered by 1 in 20 million Americans, but remembered by every single Iranian. So it solidified very deep hostility between the United States and Iran. Okay. Shah Mohammad Pahlavi was Reza's son, and there he is in the middle there with all the ribbons and medals on his shoulder. He was pro-Western. He sought to modernize the economy. He provided assistance, both intelligence and oil assistance, clandestinely to Israel. So he was an autocratic leader, totally non-democratic, but he was pro-Western in foreign policy, and that made him very useful to the United States. And every US president, from Eisenhower through Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, all those presidents were supportive of Iran really until '79 under Carter, when under Carter came the Iranian Revolution. The Shah also established the Savak, which was a very brutal secret police that arrested and tortured a lot of opponents to the Shah's regime. So this is an authoritarian monarchy that he established. And it was not particularly tied to religious practices, which was itself sowing the seeds for its own destruction, because the Iranian population, particularly those in the rural areas and the less educated areas, are deeply religious and associated with Shia Islam. Next. When Carter came into power in January 1977, one of his first national leaders that he met with was the Shah. A famous incident where he greeted him at the White House, and in a public statement, President Carter characterized the Shah as an island of stability in a sea of turmoil. This was just before frequent anti-Shah demonstrations began in '77 and '78. And there was a repetitive cycle about these demonstrations. These were demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations against the Shah. They were suppressed by the military and the Savak, in which demonstrators were killed. This was followed by a period of mourning of the people, who then renewed their demonstrations, followed by more killings, more mourning, and the growth of the opposition to the Shah. Next. The Islamic Revolution was led by that man in the poster there with the black turban. Ayatollah Khomeini. He was a very prominent Shia cleric. He was a well-known student of Shia Islam. He'd been exiled by the Shah back in 1964, so it was 15 years earlier. And he was in a suburb of Paris when he began to smuggle audio tapes. This is, of course, way before the internet and before laptops and iPhones and before modern technology. He sent audio tapes which were smuggled into Iran, in which he exhorted the population to overthrow the Shah. Speaking in Farsi, he was considered a very inspirational speaker, especially to the rural population. There's a crowd greeting Khomeini in January '79 in Tehran when he first returned to Iran. Next. There's Carter on the right and the Shah on the left, greeting him back in '77. Carter, nor the American government, nor the US intelligence community was aware that a little later on, the Shah was suffering from a terminal cancer condition. And the Shah was very torn as to how to deal with Khomeini's people. And he kept shifting back and forth between appeasing the protesters and being rough and declaring martial law against them. He appealed to Carter for assistance. Carter chose not to intervene with force to help the Shah. There's a critical point. You could think a little bit relevant to the current Middle East. It's not quite analogous, but Assad in Syria was in big trouble as an autocratic leader, and he appealed to the Russians to come in, and the Russians did, and of course Assad remains in power. Carter did not, and the Shah was weakened by his own medical condition, and this led eventually to his overthrow. Okay. And back in the fall of '78, which turned out to be the last 4 or 5 months of the Shah's tenure, Foreign Affairs, prominent journal, the journal that published George Kennan's article on containment in 1946, that published Wallstetter's article on the delicate balance of terror in 1959. Many very important pieces have been published there by world leaders, by prominent analysts. Foreign Affairs was searching for someone by the fall of 1978 who could write an article about the Iranian situation, because it clearly was boiling over and it wasn't obvious what the result would be. It turned out there were very few American academics who were true Iranian experts. One of them was a man named James Bill, who was teaching, I think, at University of Texas at Austin. Now I think he's still active. He teaches at William and Mary, at least he did until recently. And Bill wrote an article that went through several iterations and editorial adjustments, and it came out just at the end of 1978. And in that article, Bill was also, I think, married to an Iranian, spoke fluent Farsi, and had lived in Iran. So he really had the credentials to address the key issues. And in that article, Bill postulated there were 5 future outcomes for Iran. The first outcome was that the Shah would beat back the opposition and retain power. But by this time, by the mid to late fall of '78, the Shah was in a lot of trouble, and Bill did not think that the Shah would survive it. So I think he ascribed probabilities to each of these. I think he put that at less than 20% chance. A second scenario, which Bill thought somewhat more likely, was that he would step down and transfer power to his family, particularly his wife and son, who were very well known in the country and around the world, and that this would retain the ruling family control, the so-called peacock throne. So that would not lead to major changes in policy. A third option from Bill's perspective was that there were many colleagues of the Shah's who classified themselves as social democrats. Uh, Iran had had a long history with France. Many of the elite studied in France. They were fluent in French. They practiced a lot of the accoutrements of French culture. And Bill thought perhaps the Social Democrats, some combination or some key leader in parliament from the Social Democrats, would take power. He thought there was a pretty decent chance of that. That was one of the higher probability events, he thought. The fourth, especially in countries of the Middle East where there are no legitimized means of succession, the fourth was that the military would take power. There's always military coups have been prevalent throughout the Middle East. Why not Iran? So Bill analyzed the prospects of a military coup, and he thought that that also had a reasonable chance of succeeding. 3 and 4 were the more prominent ones. And the fifth, which he didn't take very seriously, there's an indigenous communist party in Iran called the Tudeh Party, Tudeh. And he thought there was some chance, maybe 10%, that they would seize power. The ironic and revealing characteristic of this list is that he never considered, this is America's top Iranian scholar, never considered that an Islamic theocracy led by the Ayatollah would in fact seize power. He just thought it was too unlikely. Pardon me. Okay, next. In January 1979, the Shah suddenly left Iran. He abdicated. And he hopped around. He went to Egypt, then Morocco, then the Bahamas, then Mexico, all to escape this Ayatollah and to seek medical treatment. And then he went to New York City for medical treatment. And this was already the time when the Ayatollah, who would come back to take power, warned the United States not to allow him into the country. But Carter did allow him in. He had treatment in New York and then went to Panama and then back to Egypt. But none of the medical treatments was successful, and he passed away at the young age of 60 in Egypt. A core point is that from the time of the Mossadegh overthrow by the CIA, which, by the way, was led by Kermit Roosevelt, the son of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a key senior CIA official, the Shah was always viewed as illegitimate by the vast majority of Iranians, that he was installed by the West, and that he did not speak for large segments of the Iranian population. It was noted, for example, that the Shah twice a year went with himself and his family, maybe more than twice a year, to St. Moritz, a very prominent Shishi French ski resort. But in 25 years of rule, from 53 to 78, he never once visited Mecca or Medina, the holiest sites of Islam. So this did not exactly build up support among wide swaths of the population. Next. There in 1979, actually it's February 1st, the Ayatollah returned to Iran from France. There he is stepping down an Air France plane on February 1st, 1979. And he was declared, and he himself declared himself as the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He formulated and declared that this was a totalitarian theocracy. He was a revered religious leader as well as a political figure. And he quickly labeled the United States as a great Satan and death to Israel as one of his top foreign policy priorities. He was hugely popular in Iran. And there you see, looks like a parking garage from the airport, thousands of people thronging to see him and to cheer him. This is all under Carter's watch. This was a defeat for Carter, but nothing compared to the failed rescue mission, which we'll talk about in a minute. Next. But before things, one thing that got going right away was Iran, bordering on Iraq. Today Iraq has a Shia leader and is pro-Iranian, but back then, Iraq, of course, was headed by Saddam Hussein, a Sunni leader in a Shia majority country. And shortly after Khomeini took power, Iraq invaded Iran. And there you see a bunch of the forces arrayed on the Iraq-Iran border. And this turned out to be a protracted, bloody, awful 8-year war from 1980 to 1988. One of Iraq's weapons was to use chemical weapons against Iranian citizens. But the Iranians were very pugnacious. They fought back against the invading forces of Iraq, and it really developed into a stalemate after 8 years. By this time, of course, Reagan had defeated Carter and come into power in 1981. He sided with Iraq because he said Iraq is just run by your typical Middle East dictator, Saddam Hussein, whereas Iran is run by a theocratic leader with core ideas which could spread throughout the Middle East. So he viewed Iran and Khomeini as a core ideological foe, which was not the case of Saddam Hussein. Any questions about that? Am I going too slow or too fast, or?
I had one quick question.
Yes.
Would you say that in light of hindsight of all of these events, that the actions of the US and UK and Iran ultimately destabilized the region?
Well, to some degree, yes. I mean, this is a region that has leaders that last for 25 or 30 years or more. So the political leadership of these countries is not unstable. They're quite stable. They're not democratic, but they're stable. So you had a case, though, with the overthrow of Mossadegh, where at least they plowed the seeds for an overthrow. Now, it took 25 years, so it didn't exactly happen overnight. But I don't think we fully understood the power of Khomeini's ideology, his appeal to vast numbers of Iranians, and the deep animosity of the Iranian people toward the United States and Britain for overthrowing their other governments. Now, after all, I mean, Khomeini and now his successor, Khamenei, have been in power since 1979. So is that a preferable outcome? Not from an American perspective. So that's over 40 years they've been in power. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some thoughts about it.
That does, thank you.
Okay. Okay, Mansuk, next slide. Now let's see how to, I don't know if, is there a slide on the rescue mission, Mansuk? I don't recall. This looks like we're getting beyond it.
Yes, we have.
There is a slide? Okay, then we'll come to it. Okay, so this is now moving ahead. After the Iran-Iraq war that ended in 88, the Ayatollah died in 89. And he was replaced by a man with a similar sounding name from an American point of view, Ayatollah Khamenei, as opposed to Khomeini. Khamenei has never had the religious stature that Khomeini had. He's a political figure. He's a sort of bureaucratic maneuverer, but not a sacred leader. And he has overseen the country since 1989, so that's over 30 years. And he's allowed partially free elections to be held, partially because he has the ability, he and his colleagues in the Revolutionary Guard that run the country have the ability to terminate the candidacy of any individual that they view as not appropriate. In recent parliamentary elections, I believe it was publicized that 7,000 candidates for different offices in Iran were eliminated by the Ayatollah for not having the right kind of views. But he has permitted, at times, people who we would call moderate to ascend to the highest elected position, which is the presidency. Remember, the Ayatollah is not elected. He's like a gift from God. He's the sacred leader. He runs the country. He's the court of last resort on all key foreign policy, defense, national security, and domestic economic issues. But the president does have quite a bit of power. And a few years before, the president had been Ahmadinejad, who was actually active in the seizure of the US Embassy in Tehran, which we'll talk about. And Rouhani, who's been the president since 2013, is the current president. And he was viewed as someone who was interested in negotiations with the US that led to the JCPOA. Next. A key US-Iranian incident took place in November 79, little less than a year after Khomeini took power, when Iranians, mostly younger men, seized the US Embassy in Tehran, and they held US diplomats hostage for 444 days, 52 hostages. Ahmadinejad is in that crowd somewhere. He was one of the demonstrators who seized the embassy. This is widely covered in the West. Of course, the US is very concerned that these people would be murdered. They weren't, they were held hostage. And this became the start of this seemingly interminable Iranian hostage crisis standoff between the US and Iran. It led to the establishment of a prominent program, which has since lost a lot of its prominence, but I don't know how many of you have seen or heard of the television show Nightline, which was launched during this period on ABC News and was moderated by Ted Koppel, who became a very prominent media figure in the United States. I'm sorry, Andrew, do you have a comment there? Andrew? Andrew Don? No?
Oh, I just wanted to mention the movie Argo is also about it.
I'm sorry?
The movie Argo.
Oh, yes, right, with Ben Affleck. That's right, that would be more likely that you'd be familiar with that, right. Thank you. Okay, so Carter was now faced with this terrible situation of what to do about these hostages. Protracted negotiations led to no progress, and he was eventually, I see we have a student, Mr. Sclafani, liked the movie a lot, okay. Carter was pressed by some of his advisors, also given the fact the economy was not in good shape in the US in 1980. And Carter was looked at as being somewhat weak, that he couldn't get the hostages released. Some of his advisors argued that if he mounted a rescue mission and was successful, this could lead to his reelection. And Carter was reluctant. He's a military man, a graduate of the Naval Academy, but not a great military interventionist. And eventually he authorized the rescue mission and involved special forces and 8 helicopters and 1 aircraft, which unfortunately led to 2 helicopters crashing in the desert that you see in the map south of Tehran. They were going to land in the desert and then go by overland route to Tehran to seize the hostages. Next. Here was the outcome: a sandstorm. 1 helicopter, 1 aircraft were destroyed, and the raid was abandoned, which really damaged Carter very severely politically. There's Carter's with a portrait on the cover of Time magazine, debacle in the desert. A very tough decision. He didn't want to risk them executing the hostages, but he felt he needed to do it to try to salvage his presidency. This is just a personal anecdote. I don't think I have this on a slide. I was actually a PhD student at Columbia in the early 70s, and I was part of a 4-person study group. We studied for our PhD exams together. Columbia had some pretty strenuous PhD exams that we all had to take, written and orals. And students were encouraged to band together in small groups to study for them. One of the people I joined with, I didn't know him before, was a man named Gary Sick, S-I-C-K. And it turned out he was a naval officer, a naval intelligence officer who knew the Middle East quite well. And I got to know him, became friends with him. And we both finished our degree quite quickly in 1973. And he returned to the Pentagon, but then after Carter was elected, he joined the National Security Council's staff. And I mentioned him because he had an interesting experience there. The head of the sort of senior member of the senior person on the NSC staff, the National Security Advisor, was Zbigniew Brzezinski, very well-known Soviet specialist, and he was a personal advisor to Carter. But underneath Brzezinski, in the Middle East, the key senior director was a man named Bill Quandt, Q-U-A-N-D-T, a very prominent scholar of Arab-Israeli relations. And Gary Sick went to work for Quandt. And Gary later told me that Quandt said, look, my specialty is the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's huge. It's very important. I'm going to spend all my time on that. I'm sorry, but you've got to deal with these secondary and tertiary issues like Iran and Iraq. So Sick became the president's chief analyst and briefer on Iran. That was during the whole Shah crisis, the fall of the Shah, the rise of Khomeini, and then the hostage-taking crisis, and then the failed rescue mission. Sick was right there. And he later wrote a book, quite a prominent book at the time, called All Fall Down, how he characterized everybody losing as a result of this fiasco. And he returned to Columbia, actually. He's been at Columbia for many years. He runs a Middle East study group there. And there's another aspect with Sick. If we have time, I'll mention him too. Okay, move on. Yeah, one of the instances that came up later was, I didn't mention, but I'll do it now, that the Shah had left and died, of course. Carter was trying to get the diplomats out of Tehran. He was unsuccessful, and yet they were successful. The day Reagan was inaugurated, Reagan won the election, they were released. So how could they be so unsuccessful for a couple of years, 444 days with Carter, and successful on the first minute of the first day with Reagan? And one theory was that Reagan and George H.W. Bush had secretly been negotiating with with Khomeini, trying to persuade him not to release the hostages until Reagan became president. Excuse me, I have to add my charger to the computer. I'll be right back. Let's see if this works. No, this isn't working. I'm sorry. Here. Having some trouble with my laptop here. I think it's working okay. So anyway, this became a big cause célèbre, a big issue. And later on, there was a congressional investigation, and Gary Sick testified that he thought Reagan and Bush were involved in postponing the release of the hostages. But after a lot of research and hearings, there was no evidence of that. So, but they were released. And very briefly, relations between Reagan and the Ayatollah weren't so bad, but then they got bad again later. Next. Now, another feature, and of course more relevant for our course and for the students, is that going back to the 70s, the Shah had great power aspirations. He thought Iran could be one of the greatest countries in the world, maybe third or fourth after the US and the Soviet Union, and on a par with Germany and Japan economically. And one feature of the prowess of Iran would be an independent nuclear force. So even though Iran ratified the NPT in 1970, the Shah never gave up his dream of Iranian nuclear weapons. And he started an Iranian research program in the mid-70s. I was in Cambridge, Mass. At that time into the 80s, and I remember in a number of my consultations with my MIT colleagues, how they often mentioned that the MIT Nuclear Engineering Department was filled with large numbers of Iranian students, and we know from their backgrounds that quite a few of them have been very active in the Iranian nuclear weapons program when they returned to their home country. Also, Russia supported Iran on the nuclear energy side and tried to develop better relations with Iran. And you see there some of the elements of Iran's efforts: the research reactors, such as one in Tehran, one in Bonab, the uranium mining facilities in Yazd, military sites, and nuclear sites, Natanz and Isfahan, and Bushehr, the reactor site, very important in the Iranian nuclear program. New slide. Mr. Parks, do you have a question? Mr. Parks?
Yeah. I was wondering what actions were taken against Iran after joining the NPT, but still continuing to work on nuclear weapons technology.
Wasn't a lot of knowledge about their program. I don't believe, the whole safeguards effort, which took a while to develop, like George Moore described, really was that sophisticated and not involved in a lot of on-site inspection in Iran. I don't know, Carl, are you familiar with that aspect of the issue?
Actually, no, not in detail.
Okay. I don't believe they were, I remember, because I began to study proliferation seriously in the early 70s, and Iran was not on the list of the worrisome countries. Okay, next slide. Nitzuk, next slide, please.
I already moved on. This is the next slide.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Thank you. So here's a more advanced slide on their program. And this is called terrorism. This is, of course, under Khomeini. They developed a clandestine uranium enrichment program. This was the key feature of their path toward nuclear weapons. They had the power plants, the Bushehr plant. Got a little noisy here. Developed with Russian assistance, uranium mines and research development programs and bomb design programs. So under Khomeini, which is after the end of the Iraq War, and still with not great ties with the United States, they greatly accelerated the Iranian nuclear program. Now it was on people's radar, and there was an effort to find more about what they were doing and to, someone shut off some background noise there? Yeah, thank you. Oh,
I
somebody,
think your mic's unmuted, Carl.
somebody washing dishes? Okay. Now, next slide. Now here enters Israel. Israel, of course, tiny country there to the northwest of Saudi Arabia. Iran, who said death to Israel. Iran, when Khomeini first came into power, there was not a virulent anti-Israeli declaratory policy by Iran, but it developed very quickly under Khomeini, and it was definitely endorsed and supported and enhanced by Khomeini. So the Israeli intelligence took great interest in Iran, very concerned about Iran nuclear weapons as a direct threat to Israel's existence, an existential threat. And in fact, over time, right to this day, the Iranian nuclear threat is the #1 concern for Israeli security, far ahead of the Palestinian issue, which is a longstanding, thorny, difficult issue with no end in sight, despite the Trump Middle East peace proposal. So one thing that Israel began to do, although it was never announced, of course, was they began a policy of targeted killing of key Iranian scientists. Scientists would leave their home in Tehran. It's a big, complicated, congested city. They'd be given cars to drive out to the facilities. And along the route, motorcycle riders would come along and slap onto the door, outside door of the cars, bombs, which would be detonated after the motorcycle left the area. So quite a few very prominent Iranian scientists were killed in that process. Then in 2008 came a really important development. This is the last year of the George W. Bush administration. The head of Strategic Command, General Cartwright, James Cartwright, had developed some ideas about using cyber techniques to force the malfunctioning of Iranian centrifuges, which had been developed by Siemens in Germany. They were Iran purchased these centrifuges from Siemens. Siemens, of course, knew every nut and bolt of the centrifuges. They built them. They designed them. And the Israelis and then the Americans, evidently, because it's never been acknowledged by either Washington or Tel Aviv, the US and Israel collaborated to try to develop cyber techniques which would cause the centrifuges to malfunction. And this is one of the key topics that President George W. Bush briefed President-elect Obama when they were transitioning from one administration to another, the end of 2008, early 2009. And Obama agreed that this was a valuable technique to use against Iran. It wasn't kinetic, it didn't involve killing of people, but it caused machines to malfunction, which would greatly reduce the ability of the Iranians to stockpile weapons-grade material. Again, neither the US nor Israel have ever publicly acknowledged that this was the case, but it's widely believed to be the case. There's an excellent book on this, which I actually use in my other course, called The Perfect Weapon by David Sanger. David Sanger is the national security correspondent for the New York Times, which has very detailed descriptions of what happened there. Next. I'm sorry, there was, I think someone was intersecting there with a question. Question about this?
Oh, yes, Professor. I was wondering if Israel formally took credit for those attacks against the Iranian scientists, or if that was just an assumption or an investigation that yielded that.
Right, the latter. There's never been any Israeli acknowledgement of any activity of this kind. This is actions of the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service.
I see. Thanks.
Now what, there's a key point now. Let's see if it's on the next slide or not. If it's not, I'll add it to my verbal discussion here. So next slide. One sec. So yeah, this is the first open use of US offensive cyber operations. Not quite open, but I mean, you know, the US never denied it, but they never acknowledged it either. But the point I want to make here was that Obama's relations with Netanyahu was the prime minister of Israel back then. And unlike today, where Trump and Netanyahu have a great relationship, and they're both sort of supreme nationalists, and they've both been charged with criminal activity. Or at least Netanyahu's been charged with criminal activity, and Trump has just been charged with malfeasance of office in the impeachment, which he was exonerated from. But you know, I'm sure you know, if you follow this at all, that Trump and Netanyahu have a very good relationship, and that, as good as that relationship is, that's how poor was the relationship between Obama and Netanyahu. Obama wanted Netanyahu to peace. He wanted him to stop settlements. He wanted him to negotiate and be willing to give up territory, none of which Netanyahu was willing to do. But more importantly, and germane to the cyber issue, it became clear to Obama that Netanyahu was preparing military attacks, conventional force attacks against Iran, that he might have been planning to destroy all of these facilities that were on the previous map. And Obama thought that would be catastrophic for the region. It would lead to a major war. The US might not be able to stay out of the war. You know, millions of people in Iran and Israel would be hurt or killed. So ironically, one of the features, one of the objectives, one of the motivations behind Obama's support for the cyber attacks was to not only delay the development of the Iranian weapons program, but to convince Netanyahu that Obama was serious about stopping the program. And by doing that, Obama would deter the Israelis from attacking the Iranians. Is that clear? Any questions about that point? It's not a widely understood point, even by people who know something about this. But there's no doubt this was a core element. By this time, another feature of US policy became economic sanctions against Iran, trying to force other countries not to buy their oil and not to buy other products, not to trade with them. And this is a policy that has been greatly accentuated and endorsed by Trump, the economic sanctions. Next. Now, finally, after the cyber attacks and the delay of the Iranian program, and then the election of Rouhani, circumstances improved for some sort of negotiation between the United States and Iran over their nuclear program. Sorry, I just have to get some water here. And this led started in 2013 to protracted two-year negotiation that evolved into a deeply complex multilateral negotiation involving the United States, the other major nuclear powers, Russia, China, Britain, and France, Germany as a major country from European Union and a major country economically in the world, Iran, and the European Union. All those countries negotiating complex multilateral agreement that produced in July 2015 something called the Agreed Framework, which held until the US from it in October of 2018. Another point is from actually a different piece, but Michael McFaul, who was US ambassador to Russia, in his memoir, pointed out the importance of the Russian support for the JCPOA. JCPOA stands for Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And there, if you take a look at that photo, I don't know if you can make it out, on the furthest to the right is Ernie Moniz, a very prominent nuclear engineer from MIT, probably a good colleague of Carl's, I would think, yes? Carl?
Yes, actually, Ernie and I worked together in fundamental nuclear physics back in the 80s and 90s. So I know Ernie very, very well.
And Ernie was not only a member of the delegation, but he was the key technical expert. So he's the equivalent of Dr. Fauci on the current pandemic. Very smart, lots of legitimacy, often but not always listened to. Next to Muniz, on Muniz's right, our left, is Secretary of State John Kerry, who had replaced Hillary Clinton and was the Secretary of State and driving force behind the negotiations. Then there's also, to his right was the Secretary General of NATO, and to his right was the Russian ambassador to the Russian foreign minister, sorry. And then you have two key Iranian officials and several other folks there. Okay, a little bit about the JCPOA. Next slide. The JCPOA had a number of really key elements to it. The first point to make about it was that Obama was persuaded early on that you can't solve all the world's problems in a single negotiation, that the key objective for the United States was to deny Iranians a nuclear weapon. And all the other features of its foreign policy, its role with proxy forces in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq, and in Hezbollah, in Lebanon. These are all key issues, but they'd have to be taken up separately another time. So this was a nuclear-only negotiation. All those bullets there are some of the key elements, that Iran would eliminate its stockpile of medium enriched uranium. This is usually 20% of U-235. It would cut its stockpile of low enriched uranium by 98%. It It reduced its centrifuges by 2/3 over 13 years. That Iran would allow the IAEA access to inspect all its facilities with 150 inspectors. That it could continue research on enrichment. And there were several other conditions. But those are that was ripping the guts out of its nuclear weapons development program. And then in turn, there would be cessation of UN and US economic sanctions against Iran. Iran received almost $2 billion in cash to cover sanctions relief. And a lot of funds that had been held up in US banks for Iran were released to them. At the same time, Obama demonstrated his continued commitment to deter an Iranian nuclear program. This set of elements was viciously and without let-up attacked by Trump throughout the 2016 presidential election. Of course, Trump didn't go into any details. He just said it was a horrible agreement. It denied the Iranians nothing, gave them everything they wanted, gave them the money to carry out all their terrorist activities. And he pledged, if he was elected, Trump, that he would withdraw the United States from the agreement. Next slide. The Iranians did do a lot after the agreement was signed, not in the nuclear area, none of which was prohibited by the agreement. They worked with the Russians to support Assad in Syria and to present forces on the Golan Heights close to the Israeli border. They strengthened Hezbollah, a key Shia group in Lebanon, which is slowly but surely becoming the majority. Lebanon is close to having a majority Shia population. What's not here, they supported the Houthis, a religious minority group against the dominant Sunnis in Yemen. And they also were involved in supporting Iraqi Shia groups attacking American forces in Iraq. So Russian military bases and positions, its proxies, and its fighting against the US-led coalition were all key elements of Iran's policies. New slide. There we are here. Support the Houthi rebels in the Yemen civil war. That's down in the lower left. Aden is part of Yemen. Great influence of the Iraqi Shia government. Support of Hamas groups. Hamas is actually Sunni, but they support the Hamas groups in Gaza against Israel. This is as of September 2.5 years ago, no, less than 2 years ago. A new slide. So that was where things stood. The JCPOA was still in operation. The Iranian program was largely frozen, but their non-nuclear activities were proceeding apace when Trump came in. He worked immediately with the Saudis and with Netanyahu and the Israelis against Iran. A major development is a bit of a typo there. Trump ordered the assassination of a key Iranian general, Soleimani, in January of this year. And he watched as the Iranians retaliated. The Iranians attacked 2 US bases in Iraq, killed had about 100 US soldiers who disappeared or resurfaced with severe brain damage. Trump originally said they had headaches, which was a little bit misleading. Hold on 1 second. I just have to move. I just have to relocate. 1 second. All right. Be right back. Okay, next slide. So here's some final sort of discussion questions we could spend a little time on. Do you think President Trump made the correct policy decision to withdraw the United States from the JCPOA? By the way, what's happened since is Iran has, if we go back to the slide, Mansuk, that has the key elements of the JCPOA, can we go back to that? Yeah, we'll go back to this. Iran has renewed its development, its stockpile of medium enriched uranium. It's renewed its operation of centrifuges. It's denied some IAEA inspectors. It's renewed research on enrichment. And it's also made declaratory statements indicating it was moving forward with the nuclear weapons development program. So now let's go back to the question slide. So one thing to consider, did Trump make the correct policy? We should try to analyze it on the merits. Was it in the US interest? Was it in the world's interest for the US to withdraw from the JCPOA? Second question, can the US count on Russian cooperation in containing Iranian influence since they're buddies and collaborating in Syria? And a little perhaps further down the road, what plausible measures can the US adopt to improve relations with Iran? So I could open this up to questions and comments from the students. If you have any thoughts, let's see about the first question. Maybe we could have a show of hands and Mansuk could count. How many of you think that Trump made the correct decision to withdraw the US from the JCPOA? I don't know, how do they indicate a show of hands with this technology?
Because we have too many participants, maybe it is a little bit hard to count all the hands, but
Okay. All right, so let's just have, would someone like to say a few words about why you think Trump made the correct decision to withdraw from the JCPOA? Anyone?
I have a question before we got to that, if it's possible. I wanted to know why Israel was not part of the negotiations for the in 2013, 2015.
Well, that's a good question, but because Israel has itself not acknowledged that it is a nuclear weapon state. Iran does not acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state. It was highly unlikely that if Iran was somehow included, that if Israel was included, that Iran would participate in the negotiations. It was complicated enough to have the Russians and the Chinese there. So Israel often finds it best if others can do some of its, can behave in a way that serves Israeli interests without the Israelis being directly involved. If that's sort of clear.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Are there any other comments on the first question? Anyone have,
Oh, sorry. You mentioned that Obama and Israel didn't have a great relationship, and so the cyber attack was a way to show the interest of the US to prevent nuclear empowerment by Iran. But
Yes.
now that the relationship between U.S. and its president and Israel and its president should be stronger, is it likely that Trump will support Israel violent manifestation or conventional attacks over over Iran, sorry?
That's a great question. I mean, if you can figure out what Trump is going to do and support, you're a better person than I am. I have no idea. I think at this stage, first of all, Netanyahu is in all kinds of great difficulty in Israel. They've gone through 3 elections. It looks like he's just resolved a new agreement with Gantz to sort of share power. Israel, as well as the United States, as well as the whole world, is dealing with a pandemic crisis. I would think this is not a propitious moment for any kind of offensive operations. Ironically, Iran too is suffering substantially from the pandemic. A bunch of their leaders have gotten sick. They did not take it very seriously. There was not social distancing for a long time in the councils of power in Tehran. So, I mean, of course, anything can happen. And you open up tomorrow's computer or newspaper, you don't know what's going to happen. But I think it seems as though the pandemic is now dominating everything. And we'll see. But we don't expect to see new armed conflict in the short term. I don't know, maybe you feel differently. I don't also think that, I mean, Trump has taken some major steps. He shifted the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is a major decision that no prior administration had done. This would only be done as part of a final settlement with the Palestinians. It's not as though Trump is unwilling to take very bold steps, inflammatory steps. But whether he'd be willing to endorse an Israeli military attack on Iranian nuclear forces, that might be a bit too far even for him. But you never know. Other comments or questions? I would say this is for you ladies and gentlemen getting into the nuclear field, and some of you getting into nuclear nonproliferation and related subjects, this will be a longer term issue that you will inherit. This is not going to disappear and go away anytime soon. The Iranian nuclear program and all the manifestations of it, could we get it resurrected? Could we get a new JCPOA? Is there anything we can do to forestall an Iranian nuclear program? They haven't yet tested. What happens if they test a device like the North Koreans? Would this trigger an Israeli attack? Could it trigger US involvement? I don't know. What about the Russians? Do you think the Russians are always lurking there in the background trying to take advantage of situations to expand its own influence? Do you think that they could be persuaded to facilitate US cooperation against Iran? Don't all speak at once. No comments. Okay. What about just in bilateral terms? Can we do things to move forward? I mean, Trump actually has said on a few occasions he's willing to talk to the Iranians. And in fact, even unconditionally. Remember, he went to Kim Jong-un, he met with him a couple of times, Singapore and North Korea. He'd be willing to talk to the Iranians. But Khamenei has said he's not willing to talk to Trump. So is there anything that can be done on a bilateral basis between the US and Iran?
Is there any stand taken by the Iranian population? Are they currently strongly anti-American and in favor of the theocratical regime, or is there any change in sight?
Well, I think public opinion in Iran is hard to come by. There have been some polls taken, and there's some Western groups doing research there. And it's been publicized that even just with this latest pandemic, there's been criticism and resistance by particularly younger students that the government was unprepared for the pandemic and the whole population is suffering. So I think, I think unquestionably there are elements of the Iranian population, it's hard to measure the quantity, who are not supportive of the regime and not supportive of the theocracy. But the reality is that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard that Soleimani commanded has total control over the key elements of power. They've got the guns. There's no one out there who can take their guns away. So I think that Khamenei and whoever might succeed him looks like they have the roots of power pretty deep in Iranian society and government.
Thank you.
Okay, tough problem, not an easy problem. This is one without an obvious answer in the back of the book. Like all the great engineering problems you get. There is no book. As Andrew Dung, that's right, there's no book. Well, that's all I have on this, but I think it provides useful background for what I'm sure will be a splendid lecture by Scott Kemp on the actual details of the JCPOA negotiations. So you'll get together in groups on Wednesday to think about the crisis simulation, and then we'll have Scott Kemp next Monday. Any final thoughts from anybody? Professor Van Bibber?
No, thank you for an excellent review, Michael.
Okay. Thank you. Well, stay safe, everyone. To be
All right.
continued. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.